I'm just conscious we want to have a nice session where we can actually have some opportunities to discuss the points later on. So, good afternoon once again, good morning, good evening to everybody who's joining us from around the world. Welcome again to another edition of a webinar here at Civil Service College. This one is focusing on from data to decisions, communicating evidence for effective public policy. My name is Tanai. I'll be your host. I'm one of the account managers here at the Civil Service College. Joining me and who's going to be delivering the webinar is Thomas Foster.
Hello.
So a little bit about who we are. If Thomas, you can go to the next slide for me. So CSC, we focus solely on understanding organization's training needs as well as delivering tailored solutions. Our tailor-made approach means that we work with you at every step to create a bespoke training course that meets your specific objectives as well as learning requirements. In the UK, we're a trusted supplier to a lot of His Majesty's governmental departments, for example, Home Office, NHS, Civil Service Commission. And some of our top series is delivered are leadership and management, communication, as well as personal development. Now, a little bit about Thomas himself. Thomas was a fast stream starter at the civil service. And the one thing that I know about Thomas as well, he started in 2009. He's worked on numerous number of projects, including the Coalition Era, Spending Review, the Work Program, as well as the Universal Credit, before working across financial regulation. Since 2015, he has led high-profile communications and policy work at the Department of Transport, including rail franchising, as well as becoming a full-time coach, trainer, and consultant in 2020. I think I've missed out a few things, Thomas, but I don't want to talk too much. So I'll hand over to you so that we can kickstart the session off.
Thank you very much. It was an awful lot of bits and pieces I got up to during my time in the civil service, but I think we've hit a couple of highlights there. So I think we can leave it there and get on with the topic if that suits everybody. There will be opportunities for Q&A as we go through. So if you have any Qs, please do drop them in the chat. And we will do our very best to get back to you with the A's. So we are here to talk about data, its role in policymaking, its importance in policymaking, and how to use it effectively, how to communicate it effectively when making policy decisions. I know we have a lot of people here today, both from the UK and globally. Civil Service College does have a global audience. One of the reasons I particularly enjoy working with them. My examples are likely to be focused predominantly on the UK government, but I would urge you to think about how these map across to different countries, different governments, and see the similarities. One of the great things about data is it allows us to see ourselves with a degree of honesty. It allows us to see ourselves, the countries we are involved in governing, the organizations we work for, the people we are working to help in whatever capacity that might be, with a degree of honesty. We will, as we go through the next hour, we will look at the advantages of using data in this way, and we'll look at some of the risks and some of the limitations as well. There is we have a comment from somebody already saying that they are on mute. Can I just get a quick hand up, Tendai, if you can hear me okay?
Yes, if everybody can just let us know if they can. Yeah, I can hear you clearly.
Okay,
perfect.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It may be then, I look blue, according to Stephen. I suspect that's an effect of the lighting rather than anything I can particularly do anything about. So what I will do is I'll have a quick check to see if I can change that with a very quick setting. Otherwise, I may just have to remain blue. It may just be one of those things that we have to live with in this as a result of natural lighting and a Teams meeting. Hopefully I've got a few hands up. Thank you to those people who put their hands up to indicate that they can hear me okay. And yep, smurfing all the way. Definitely better that than the Avatar film, which I must admit I found a little bit disappointing. Okay, the value of data in policy. There's three things here which are not absolutely conclusive, but they're some of the key value of data in policy making. It allows for evidence-based decision making. When we talk about decision making and policy making here in the UK, we place a considerable emphasis on evidence-based decision making. And a corollary to that is that the evidence we're talking about is almost always grounded in statistical data of some sort. The main reason for that is while the UK is not one of the biggest countries in the world by any stretch, it's fairly sizable. We are looking at a population at the moment of around 68 million, and it seems to be growing. One of the things that means is that we need a way of looking at the country, understanding the state of affairs in the country, and being able to analyze solutions and eventually evaluate solutions as well that takes account of all of those 68 million people. And that is not a thing we can do really with any system apart from a statistical system. There is no way to do this simply based on our relationships, based on the people we know, based on the people we grew up with. We can't even do it anecdotally from reading stories, reading news reports. It's one thing and a very tragic thing to know, for example, that somebody has died in a house fire, but without knowing how common such instances are, we don't know whether this is something that requires an episodic intervention, perhaps police investigation, or simply was a tragedy, or whether this is something that actually merits government intervention because there is some kind of systemic failing there. So data is a way of allowing us to look at ourselves as a country and to know ourselves as a country. I have been doing training full-time, as Tendai said, along with coaching and consulting since 2020, but I have been doing it part-time alongside being a civil servant for quite a while longer than that. I was very pleased more than a decade ago when my first ever commercial training opportunity was with Civil Service College, and even better than that, I was able to go to the Office for National Statistics for my first ever training on how Whitehall works, which is still one of the most popular ones we do. And I was able to go directly to the Office for National Statistics. I will admit to being a huge statistics geek. I'm not an analyst. I don't claim that prestige within my work as a civil servant, but I am a huge statistics geek. And whenever it's been my opportunity, whenever I've had the opportunity to build policy teams, to build decision-making teams, I've always tried to make sure that either we have somebody with that analytical capability in the team, or at the very least, we have access to that resource because these people are incredibly, incredibly valuable. Data is really the only way we can understand ourselves as a country, and the same is true for the vast majority of countries. Things I thought were perhaps true about the UK based on my upbringing and my education were very swiftly proven to be wrong, erroneous, not because of any malice, simply wrong, when I moved to London for my first job. And as I moved through different jobs and different roles, went to university, went to law school, did all kinds of other bits and pieces before eventually ending up as a civil servant, I met different groups of people who had very different approaches and very different outlooks on life, all valuable, all useful for what they contribute to the diverse fabric of this country. But the only way to really encompass them all is with data. And that is where we start with our premise that data matters in any kind of decision making on this scale. Data matters at the beginning of the policy cycle. Data also matters at the end of it. If you are looking at a policy, you want to know on some level how well it's worked. If you can, Now, I'm going to be very honest and possibly a little bit controversial here. Sometimes you can't check whether a policy has worked. Some policies simply cannot be evaluated because for whatever reason, the data is simply not meaningfully collectible. Consulted a while ago on a particular piece of policy work, not for the UK government, but for another government that was looking at ways of reducing domestic abuse. And their policy approach to this, the policy approach we developed, was to put up posters with appropriate helplines, most of which were non-governmental helplines, in women's loos and other spaces where women might be found on their own, as a way of communicating with them directly in a space where, if they are experiencing abuse, then they are very unlikely to have their abuser present with them. This was simply not a process that lent itself to evaluation. We had no real way of checking how many people saw these adverts or what actions they took as a result. We were, for perfectly good reasons, looking at distributing numbers of organizations, what we call third sector organizations, which is to say organizations that are not part of government but generally work to the public good, like charities, that work to help women in these situations. And many of those organizations, for perfectly sensible reasons, were uncomfortable sharing too much of their information with the government in question, or indeed would have been with any government. We know certain things in advance. We know, for example, this is not going to solve the problem outright. We know that not all victims of domestic abuse are women. We know that not all perpetrators of domestic abuse are men. However, the data we did have led us to believe that we would be able to get useful information in front of a large proportion of our intended audience through this approach. We had to do this knowing and accepting that we would never be able to do a really effective evaluation of it. The policy issue was important enough that we went ahead regardless. So I put that out there as an example, as a kind of miniature case study of the fact that while measuring the impact of a policy is always something to be aspired to, it is not always something that is possible. Government generally does things not because they are easy, because they are necessary. To slightly paraphrase Kennedy, we do things in government because there is a need for them. If there is a need for them, but we simply don't have the evidence to define a precise solution, or there is a need for them, but we cannot be certain how we can measure the results, often the right thing to do is to go ahead and do them anyway, and to simply accept that we will have to continue looking for better evidence, looking for ways to measure results in future, but sometimes the doing of the thing is important enough that we go ahead even when we don't have the data. And I say that because although we are going to be talking about data for this webinar, it's important to recognize not just its importance, but also its limitations. We mustn't become bound by it. We must continue to see it as a tool. And like many of these tools, it makes an excellent servant, but a poor master. Finally, on this slide, we have accountable policy as an advantage of data, as a value of data in the policy-making process. This is very much a priority in the UK, has been for some time now. It's something that more and more governments are recognizing the value of, making sure that decisions are made in a way that is often in quite minute levels accountable. Not because, as members of government, we particularly care about undermining our own government by demonstrating mistakes or providing ammunition to an opposition, but because the population at large can better judge how effectively democracy works, how effectively their government is working, if they see as many stages as possible and the evidence base for the decision making. Because sometimes government decisions go wrong, and that again is something we simply have to live with. But the difference between a government decision that went wrong because it was badly thought through, because it was pursued with regard to some set of values that were not consistent with the values of the country or with the stated values of the government, and public government policy that has gone wrong simply because, to be honest, government work is difficult. Government work is challenging. Climbing mountains is challenging. Not everybody who does it succeeds. And that's not because they're rubbish mountaineers, it's because it's a bloody big mountain. And government work is a lot like that. Sometimes we don't succeed, and sometimes we don't succeed despite our very best efforts. And being able to demonstrate with a clear chain of reasoning, going back to the data, why we pursued a particular course, can be incredibly useful for making sure that we maintain the confidence of the country to keep going forward and keep trying further things, and to distinguish between good government work that happens to have fallen short of the considerable challenges we face, and government work that has been suborned by corruption, by incompetence, by values that differ from those stated by the government. So making sure that we're building our work on a robust data supply is an important part of that chain that allows for accountability, and from the point of view of the government, allows for sustained confidence as long as we deserve it. I'm going to move on now to my next slide, and I am eventually going to come in a couple of slides' time to the first Q&A session. So please do, if you have any questions, please do feel free to drop them into the chat, and my colleagues on this call will collate them and will present them as questions for that first slot. So key data types in policy making. We can see here two types of data. Hopefully these are terms that are fairly familiar to people. If not, they are terms that I would encourage you to look into further. When we talk about quantitative data, we are talking about data expressed in numerical terms. For example, in the UK, we can say that of the four countries, let's be honest about the constitutional term, that make up the UK, roughly 90% of the population of the UK live in England. Roughly 5% live in Scotland, about 3% in Wales, and 2% in Northern Ireland. I noticed a hand up from one of our colleagues. If I could, for technical reasons, I think we have to have all of the microphones locked off to prevent us getting into problems with too much background noise. If you have any questions, could I ask you to just pop them in the chat, and my colleagues will pick them up. So with quantitative data, we can break down the population of the UK. We can do it far more precisely than that, but approximately 90% live in England, 5% in Scotland, 3% in Wales, and 2% in Northern Ireland. That governs policy making in a variety of ways. If, for example, we found out that we were spending 50% of a particular funding package on programs in Wales, where 3% of the population live, we could ask ourselves, are we right to be doing this? And the answer might well be yes. The answer might well be that the potential for stimulating future growth, or the need to redress past lack of investment, actually makes this an entirely appropriate thing to do. The data does not answer the question, but it does allow us to ask it in a thoughtful and informed way. Qualitative data is data that is not expressed in numbers. It's broadly speaking data that is expressed in words. How, for example, do people feel about living in England versus living in Scotland or Wales or Northern Ireland? If you are taking people's answers as pros, I very much enjoy the weather where I live, but I wish we had better theatre services, or I enjoy the relative isolation of where I'm able to live. Sometimes the weather can be tough, questions like that. I enjoy living in the same area as my parents and my family have lived for generations, but I wish there were more jobs in the area. There we are looking at qualitative data. We are looking not at the quantity of a thing, but at the quality of the thing, at the experience, often the subjective experience of the thing. We can then apply certain filters to that to convert the qualitative data into quantitative data. Often this is done to try and make qualitative data more manageable. For example, we could ascribe code A to every reply that suggests people are basically happy. We could ascribe code B to people who are basically happy but wish there was more employment around, code C to people who are basically happy but wish there were more theatres around, and so on. until we feel like we have, in Croydon, Stephen Basie says he has a really nice fried chicken shop. Very good. There were quite a few of those where I used to live in London, and it's quite entertaining because obviously the people opening the shops had got the hang of the fact that Kentucky Fried Chicken was the big brand, and there was quite a run of other chicken shops named after various American states. My favorite being Alaska Fried Chicken, which I'm not sure is a real thing, but it was a very good fried chicken shop. Probably still is, if you get a chance to go there. So when we look at qualitative data, we're looking at things like this, things that aren't expressed numerically. You can convert them into quantitative data, number data, by ascribing codes to them and saying, well, 20% of people fell into code A in that they liked where they were but weren't happy about the employment prospects. 20% fell into code F who didn't like where they were, even though the employment prospects were good. Things like that. Inevitably, with converting qualitative data into quantitative data, you lose some of the nuance. You make it more manageable, but you lose some of the nuance because you're cutting out some of the subjective experience, some of the values. For example, in the chat at the moment, we have a debate about the relative values of chicken shops in Bromley versus Croydon. And now I have a strong temptation to go and try them. Maybe we should do a future webinar where we test out various chicken shops. And we can report the results both quantitatively and qualitatively. So when we are looking at government data, we are looking at these. They have different values. Quantitative data or numerical data is the data that gives us the broadest picture. On the other hand, qualitative data gives us a more nuanced picture, but it is often a lot more a lot more resource intensive. Even the process of going through and converting it to qualitative data. No, sorry. Even the process of going through and converting it to quantitative data, to number data, can be extremely resource intensive. So if you are embarking on a project with a commitment to do that, for example, you're asking people questions in a consultation, think carefully about how much resource you're going to be able to deploy afterwards to process the qualitative data. So, having looked at types of data, I have a question for you, and I believe my colleagues are going to put a poll up. Here we go. So, policy making in government. We're going to talk about government here. Obviously, organizations have policies, companies have policies. For these purposes, we're going to focus, if we can, on government. Do we think policy should be evidence-led or values-led? I'm given to understand we can't see who has replied to a vote in a particular way. So don't worry, your votes will be anonymous. So we've got votes coming in. Evidence-led is taking a strong first lead. We have some interesting comments here. Not mutually exclusive. Where is the both option, says Jane. Not mutually exclusive was a comment by Barbara. So very good point here from someone called Francis. I like to think my values are evidence-based. Absolutely. We all aspire to have evidence-based. Policy making should be based on evidence, but led by its values. Steve Kent coming in, being evidence-led is a value. I really like that point. That's a really good one. Being evidence-led absolutely is a value. I have spent my life being fascinated by politics, and I would have very much liked to have gone into party politics here in the UK. I had a few opportunities when I was young. Quite honestly, I couldn't reconcile myself to being so committed to a party that I was willing to sort of move away from what the evidence actually suggested to me to some kind of loyalty. So that was what took me to the civil service, and the longer I spent in the civil service, the more I appreciated the emphasis of evidence-led as a value. Owen O'Neill says value-led, but supported or rejected based on evidence. Victoria, always a risk that the values of individuals will take precedence over the evidence. I think it's reasonable to say to some extent that in the same way that evidence can be inconclusive, certainly from my experience in government, and this might be because I tended to seek out what I felt were the most interesting policy areas, we found there was evidence, but often the evidence fell short of being absolutely definitive. So while we would have liked to have simply been evident, I'm a technocrat at heart. I'm a big fan of evidence. There is a tendency I've noticed in my career among technocrats like me to have a tendency to move towards what one might jokingly refer to as totalitarianism, whereby if you are trying to get a perfect technocratic solution to a policy, you think, well, let's just make a record of everybody and get more and more data in, make everybody tell us all of this data about their lives, and then we'll have exactly the evidence base we need. But for obvious reasons, that's not always a practical thing to do. Okay, so I am going to offer up on the next slide a take on this, which I think fits with quite a lot of what has been said in the chat. We came up with a strong lead for evidence led in the polls. Certainly here in the UK, this is how we tend to do it. We like our policy to be evidence constrained. And what we mean by that is we should not be going beyond the evidence. We should not be doing things that the evidence suggests is counter to our stated goals and purposes. In an ideal world, there is something to be said for the idea that the more evidence there is out there in the world, the more people's values will converge. And to some extent, that is true. There are certain things that might have been considered de rigueur values a century ago that are now well outside the pale and something that few people would hold to. But if there's one thing we see from democracy, it's that people have values that go into spaces that quite often evidence doesn't touch. And people need to have some sense that government is responsive to their values. One of the great advantages of democracy is that it allows for this sense of a connection between a people and their government, their changing government. Quite often, governments find themselves with far too many calls on their time and far too little money, resources, simply time to do everything they want. And to some extent, the government will justify their choices based on the idea that they represent the values of the people who happen to vote for them. The point of this slide is to make two hopefully complementary points, and in doing so, to flag, as people already have, I think, in the chat very clearly, a risk of this approach. On the one hand, policy should be led as far as possible by evidence. Going against the evidence base is rarely a good idea. That is almost the definition of the evidence base. On the other hand, we find ourselves quite often short of evidence in these things that, as we talked about earlier, government has to do. In the same way that we can't always evaluate our policies afterwards, we cannot always point to data that makes one solution invariably preferable to the other. Often there are values-based decisions to be made in that space. Sometimes what we mean by values are informed judgments. Quite often government data will feature assumptions, it will feature analogies, comparisons, certain assumptions connecting one data set to another. And although these are informed judgments by people who have experience in the area, they are not the same as hard data themselves. And it is in this space that in a democracy, we have to turn to the values of the elected leaders. And we have to look to the democratic idea that if these leaders do not meet the country's needs, they will be replaced. When we look at the advantages of democracy, this capacity for feedback and for change features far more highly in most studies than the idea that a voting population will necessarily always make good decisions as to who leads them. And so at the very pinnacle of policy making, we have this space where, as civil servants, as I spent my career, we have to hand the policy over to the decision makers at the top of the organization. In our case, the elected politicians who will make the final decision. It is a near universal practice in UK government to hand a decision to a policymaker with three options. Each option analysed, each option costed, each option with the most robust possible evidence. Sometimes the mere practicalities don't allow for this, and we find ourselves with two options. At other times, we find ourselves sometimes merely with one option because the alternatives are simply so egregious that there is no way they can be made to sound like plausible options. But overwhelmingly, we strive to give three options precisely so that we recognise that democratic role, but we make sure that we are giving as much evidence as can be gathered to the policymakers to make these decisions. The risk within this is, of course, that the value-based decision space, which is, I think, fairly integrated into any kind of democratic system, does leave open scope for bias, for prejudice, for conscious pursuit of self-interest. We must obviously look to other parts of the process to try to constrain that, but the more evidence-based the advice is, the harder it is to make decisions that go against it. And the more data and evidence is placed in the public domain, the easier it is to make arguments for or against a position and to identify when the values-based part of the decision-making process, the democratic as opposed to technocratic part of the decision-making process, is being used properly versus when it is being used as a cover for other other priorities or other behaviours. And one of the great British constitutional theorists famously said, "Sunlight is the best disinfectant." The more information is in the public domain, generally speaking, the better we can drive bad decision making out of government. So I am going to take a pause there and pick up any questions that people want to put in the chat before we move on to the second half of the webinar. We've had some.
Sorry, Thomas. No, I was going to say there was a comment in there from Christine D'Souza. She says evidence is only as good as the questions you ask. It must be led by ethics. Then we've got another one from and she says values driven but evidence informed. However, nowadays every evidence should be double checked.
Yes, that is very true. Funnily enough, I was doing some policy training the last couple of weeks, and every day we have discussed the importance of double checking the policy making that we do, double checking the evidence. Certainly, in my experience as a policymaker, we would often find third-party organisations coming to us with evidence that they claimed supported whatever investment they happened to want, and often this was entirely valid. But absolutely, my first step in that process was always to get one of the analysts from my area to have a look at it and just check that that everything has been done properly. Do we have any other questions? Any other comments people want to put forward?
Well, there's a comment here from Stephen, which is a different angle. He said, on the religious front, values have always driven policy for centuries. Parliamentary privilege, education, assisted dying, women's rights, adoption, etc. Without any quantifiable evidence or data, everyone can have an opinion, but everyone can offer evidence. And that seems to be very popular with our reactions.
Yeah, and there's a really good point here. That values have always existed, and they will always exist. When we get down to it, we have to choose some kind of value. Ultimately, we have to choose something. We have to choose the idea that human well-being is better than its lack, and I think that's a value most of us would agree on. But in theory, we have to recognise that that is itself a value. Somebody else could say that actually human well-being is irrelevant. and there would be no way of, I suspect, definitive. There have been some very interesting books published on this, but there is no definitive way of proving that human well-being is a thing to value. It is quite simply something that, as for the vast majority of us, we choose to value, and therefore it drives policy making. Couple of other questions here, I think.
Yeah, so we've got another comment from Andrew. And this is, we hear about fake news regularly. Is false news and unreliable AI content increasingly guarded against in policy making?
It's a really good question, Andrew.
Mm.
I think the answer is it's something people are increasingly becoming aware of. It's something that, to be honest, is fairly well guarded against anyway. I say this as someone who has considerable regard for how fast AI is changing things, but actually the processes by which policy making has tended to gather its evidence base are pretty hard for things like fake news and AI content to infiltrate. Because of the way government gathers its data in the first place, I suspect the more you get to the political side, the more you will see things like outrage provoking fake headlines getting incorporated. I've certainly seen plenty of that appearing on social media. But I think as far as government decision making is going, for the moment, the existing processes are pretty much what you need, which is a very robust process of going back and saying, okay, where did this come from? Where did this data set come from? Who created it? What processes did they use to create it? And really checking that kind of thing back to first principles. And often making sure that you are moving through existing social networks as well, knowing that if a data set comes from a random email address, if it doesn't come from Charlie, who always sends the data over from Transport Focus, then that rings an alarm bell, and you think, hang on, is somebody sending me a bunch of data I shouldn't have?
Okay, so this is another interesting one. This is
Yep.
from Ben. How do you balance competing evidence or truth? There's still scientists that say climate change is not being driven by humans, even though the majority will say the opposite.
So there is the scientific debate around climate change is a particularly interesting example of something like this, in part because in many ways it is an outlier. When you look at the scientific influences on climate change, they are so many and so complicated that it is actually surprisingly difficult to reduce the evidence for climate change down to something that is comprehensible. And as a layperson, I certainly wouldn't want to weigh in and make those decisions myself. The more scientists are willing to talk about a consensus within their own field, the more confident you can be that there really is something there. But ultimately, the scientists have a job to do. They check each other. They check each other very aggressively. It is built into both the scientific method and perhaps a little more than it should be the structure of our current academy, that scientists repeatedly check each other's work, that they often quite aggressively try to find flaws in what each other have done. In a way, that's a good thing. Adversarial search for truth is what scientific method is to some extent based on. But in these situations, we simply have to go with the fact that there is a measurable majority of scientists, a strong majority, who are happy to say that this is where the consensus sits, and we simply have to follow that.
Right, and I think I'll pick another one, and I'll come back to the other comments from Francis and Dan in a minute. But this is an interesting one because you mentioned earlier the processing qualitative data, and this is from Flora, by the way. You mentioned earlier that processing qualitative data into quantitative data is resource intensive. I found the MS Copilot is very efficient at supporting the processing of data, such as deductively coding other category server responses into existing categories. How far do you think AI can perform or support the analyst role in policy teams?
I think there is definitely a future for AI use in this. And as you're showing, there is a present for that as well. It is something that definitely has value. I am a little bit skeptical right now of trusting AI to manage entire data sets. Not because the risk of them getting something wrong is particularly high, but because the consequences are significant. So it's one of those sort of relatively low probability, but quite high impact if it turns out you have missed something. My approach with this, and indeed for the relatively few things I do use AI for, is to repeat, as Flora has come down here and said, always need a human in the loop to double check. The big risk area with AI, I suspect, is going to be those tasks where we want AI to do it simply because a human can't do it, and therefore there is no way to have a human double checking it because it's beyond human capability anyway to perform these kind of calculations. There is always, and whenever I talk about AI, which I do obviously quite a bit at the moment, I will encourage everybody to make sure that whatever you're using with AI is consistent with the organization's policies, particularly around data security. They are introducing a new generation of laptops with things called NPUs, or neural processing units, which basically up the processing power so that you can have AI capability built into your laptop. But until we get there, don't forget that if you put something into ChatGPT, that you are putting that information into a third-party software that may not have been vetted by your information IT process. Please, Steve asks, please can everyone in this call confirm that they are human? Otherwise, I will assume that you are AI. Based on what a hard time I have pressing all the squares with crosswalks or all the squares with buses, I think there is a very good chance I am AI, frankly. So, I make no promises on this score. The only thing I can say in favour of that is if I were AI, I'm sure whoever designed me would have made me better looking. That's my main claim to being human. Okay, should we move on to the remainder of the course now, and then we can pick up the remaining questions. There's some really good questions in here, and I really would like to get back to them. However, I'm able to do that. But we have just a few more bits to go through here. Okay, so what do values contribute to data? So in a way, we've touched on a lot of this stuff, whether it's been actually really good conversation. I'm never entirely sure how the conversations in these kind of meetings are going to go. This has been a really good one. In fact, it seems to be keeping going, which is always a great thing to see. So well done, everyone, on that score. Values tend to contribute things like salience, focus, and in some cases, even justification. Why do we care about human well-being? Well, we care about it because we choose to. It is fundamentally a human choice. There are ways of trying to make it scientific, but fundamentally it comes down to the justification for thinking that human well-being is better than humans without well-being, or systems that do not generate as much human well-being as they could. Fundamentally comes down to a values thing. If we don't think of it as a values thing, then that is because it is quite widely shared. And while there are many divisive values, there are plenty that are so widely shared that we simply don't think about them. In a world of scarce resources, as we are, values can also increase things like the focus, tell us what do we want to focus on, what do we want to focus our resources on. And of course, people often determine the salience of issues by their values. Something that, as a voter, something that strongly counters your values is likely to seem more prominent to you than something that is perhaps equally prominent for you objectively, but doesn't impact on your values. So it's useful for those of us who want our governments to retain the confidence of the population, as on some level we all must, to be aware that people's values are determine the salience of issues, even when the data doesn't necessarily speak to this. You can see this in America at the moment. There is quite a prominent dichotomy in America where an awful lot of Americans, and I think you can see the same thing in the UK, think that both crime and violent crime are increasing, when in fact either by significantly larger amounts than they are, or when they are in fact decreasing. So salience can salience values inform how people see the salience of issues, even when it runs contrary to the data. And that is something that government always has to be aware of, even when we might wish to be wholly data-driven ourselves. We are still government of the people, for the people, and to a certain extent by the people. Data. So some little myths here. I think, to be honest, again, we've had really good chat in this. Yeah, Stephen recommends Stephen Basie recommends Steven Pinker's book, which I believe is Enlightenment Now. No, it's Better Angels of Our Nature. Although he picks up on similar points in Enlightenment Now, I believe, and is definitely good on this topic. Data is not autonomously conclusive. It cannot make policy decisions. You need some kind of human judgment in there in the first place. Data is neutral. Data is not always neutral. Biases can occur during collection, they can occur during interpretation, and they can affect results. An awful lot of medical data is only now being recognized as data that was collected by what at the time were regarded as perfectly rigorous, scientifically valid studies, but they only involve men. And that in and of itself, and indeed sometimes they only involve white men. And those are two fairly significant vectors where we have to recognize that actually that does undermine and introduces a degree of bias into the data. Volume matters. More data does not guarantee better policies. Quality and relevance are more important than sheer volume. Having said that, volume does have its own significance. If you don't know how large, if somebody's telling you percentages, but they are not telling you what the denominator of the percentages, i.e. how many people are in the sample, then they are not telling you everything you need to know to understand that percentage. 70% of people could mean 7 people out of 10, quite frankly. So if anyone gives you a percentage but doesn't tell you what the denominator is, what the number of people in the percentage sample is, what 100% would be, go back to them and ask, because they are denying something that is extremely useful to you there. Data is not a prerequisite of policy making. As I talked about, that policy exercise I had done recently. It is not a prerequisite. Sometimes you have to go ahead with a policy, even in the absence of solid evidence to support it. Some policies are simply so imperative that you have to go ahead with it. Jane comes in and says it is if you want money from HMT, from the Treasury Department. That is absolutely true. I spend a lot of my career working with Treasury on one way or another. They are lovely people, but they have a very important job to do, and they do it well. And that very much involves making sure that you can show everything. You can show you're working as rigorously as possible. In fact, my first ever policy job was working on something called the Work Programme, which was back in 2010, in the summer of 2010. We were working on a comprehensive spending review, and that basically involved going to Treasury. I was a lowly person, a minion at the time, but it involved my team going to Treasury to present what we thought was a really good evidence base for changing the funding basis of employment programs for getting people back to work. And this absolute genius of an analyst from Treasury just tore our evidence base to shreds over the course of an hour-long meeting. So absolutely, you definitely need to have evidence if you want to do things. On the other hand, there are ways, even in government, of getting things done otherwise. In the UK government, that tends to mean having the Prime Minister's backing, or where relevant, a Deputy Prime Minister. I've worked on plenty of projects where the Treasury Department have grumbled about things, but the Prime Minister has wanted it to go forward, and it has. There are times when, to be honest, this is the right thing to do. There are times when, for example, I was involved in a situation quite a few years ago where the governing party wanted to commit to certain improvements to rail infrastructure in the north of England, which was very much behind in its rail improvements. And we simply could not find the evidence to argue that this was good value for money. The way that value for money was calculated simply did not support the idea that this was good value for money. And our political leader, our Secretary of State at the head of the department, said on the record, this is important enough to go ahead regardless. This matters enough. We know we need to do things. We know this is something of all the things, this is the most likely to have a positive impact. So we choose to go ahead with it anyway. And that was all done publicly and on the record. So, there are circumstances when when decisions are made in advance of data because there is some imperative. Effective use of data in briefings. This is the last significant topic I'm going to cover today. Always make sure that data is being presented clearly. Salience is not the same as relevance. I've started doing quite a bit of training on briefing recently, and this is a point that comes up again and again and again. Something may be salient, but does not make it relevant to the topic in hand. In fact, an awful lot of things are salient to you, especially if you are an expert in the field. Very few of them will be relevant to the person you are briefing. If, for example, you are summarizing the data outcomes of a consultation exercise, then notifying the person you are briefing of the dates on which the consultation was done may well be very salient because those dates will have ruled your life for a few months. They are not necessarily relevant unless those dates have produced something controversial. For example, you've done an education-based consultation over the school holidays and you need to explain why it was imperative. The mere fact that it was done in accordance with all appropriate guidelines is enough. You don't need to specifically necessarily go into exact dates, things like that. That said, any kind of briefing is fundamentally an exercise in pleasing your audience. It's as true of this webinar as it is true of sitting in front of a minister. I know the message, but I need to make sure the audience knows it when I'm done, and that means I need to spend a lot of time thinking about my audience. I would encourage any of you who do data-driven briefings to think about the audiences to whom you deliver them, and as much as you possibly can, adapt your style to whomever you're briefing. If they have private secretaries, if they have PAs, those people will normally know how they like to consume data. Most people find it harder to consume data than they do verbal briefings with words, whether that's an oral spoken briefing or whether it's a written briefing. That makes it particularly important that if you are doing data-driven briefing, you take the time, if you possibly can, to make sure that the briefing is in the appropriate style. And if it's not, to take feedback, to solicit feedback. Some years ago, I ran a briefing team, and we had in, for a while, we had in all of our emails as a kind of automated signature, we hope this briefing has been appropriate. However, if there is any feedback you would like to give us on the structure, form, tone, style, a few words like that, please use this link. And we had a little survey set up so people could come back and say either it was good, but I needed my data expressed differently, things like that. And that was just an automatic part of how we express briefings, soliciting this feedback. And it is never more important than when you're doing it with data, because data is even harder to comprehend often than verbal briefings, and people will have an even greater variety of data will have an even greater variety of ways in which it is consumed and which it is needed. So one little image I would like to leave you with. This is the data to policy pyramid. We have raw data, analysis, interpretation, application, and at the very pinnacle, policy, and within that pinnacle, I suppose, briefing. This obviously is not a prescriptive pyramid. You don't have to follow things in exactly this way. The middle sections, analysis, interpretation, and application, can blur a bit. There is no guarantee that every organization will do it this way. Generally speaking, raw data and analysis are the province of analysts and numerical specialists. By the time we get into interpretation, we are blending that with policy, the work of policy specialists, and that continues as we go further up the pyramid. Data-driven policy success. This hopefully will wrap it up a little bit. If we are using evidence-based decision-making, we are using robust data analysis to make sure that it is well-grounded. Transparency and accountability. Again, as we talked about at the beginning, it shows what we're doing, and therefore, hopefully, it improves outcomes and trust. Shouldn't the pyramid be more of a circular loop? Arguably, yes. The reason why it's expressed as a pyramid is because the amount of raw information tends to become less as we go on. So for these purposes, you often have huge amounts of data which get slimlined as they're analyzed. It's probably more of a kind of pinnacle than an actual pyramid. But yes, a spiral or a loop, certainly any kind of policy making exercise, you are very much encouraged to think about it as a loop, and make sure that right at the very beginning, the policy development work you're doing has at least pays some attention to the question of, okay, how am I going to evaluate this? And ideally, how is my evaluation at the end of this going to result in more evidence for the next group of people? In an ideal world, your analysis should be the data that the next group uses as part of their data set. There's a question here from Mindspace, which is either a corporate account or a fantastic name. Either way, I will hand that one over to you, Tendai.
I was actually going to say, apologies, everybody. I started off the webinar without really telling you what's going to happen with the recording. I think I was too excited for us to start the session. So we will share the recording with everybody probably on Friday morning. Reason why I say Friday is we usually take about 48 hours roughly. So you receive that and you can then extract the slides from the video as well. But if you haven't received it by Friday, please do let me know. I think everybody's got my contact details as well, but we will share them as well after. Right.
Thank you very much, Tendai. So let's close off with a couple of couple more questions, if we have just a couple of minutes left. Where I think policy folks start on the pyramid, asks Jane. I think, generally speaking, as far as possible, you want it to be a kind of smooth handover. So you don't just want a sort of cold handover where you go from analysis and you get a bunch of analysis. I'm a big fan of integrating the policy teams and the analytical teams as much as possible, having analysts temporarily shadowing policy teams or working on a particular policy project, and vice versa. Analysts, but policy folks then going back and potentially working in an analytical team. I think the more you can do that for more different types of teams. You can do it the other way with operational people, getting operational people to come and work with you on your policy team, and then encouraging your operational people to go back and to your policy people to go and work on the implementation team when the time comes. So I would encourage as much of a smooth handover as possible, and I would encourage as much ongoing communication as possible between the two groups. I'm afraid I made a slight error and I uploaded the penultimate version of the slide deck rather than the final version. So in order to get my very last slide, I am just going to drop off and bring up what I'm hoping Tendai will confirm is the correct final slide for this. Hopefully you can all see that now.
Yes, that is Thomas.
Excellent. I mean, thank you very much. Apologies. Version control is ever a goblin.
What I was going to say is we will answer some questions now. We've probably got a minute. If we can, everybody, can we just give a round of applause for those online to Thomas? Thank you very much for your time. Can you also scan the barcode for us so we can get your feedback? Your feedback allows us to also come up with other interesting topics for us to share with you and discuss with you when we do have the next webinar, which will probably be in the next month. So look out for this space. But in terms of a couple of questions before we leave, I think there was one here from Johnny saying, in public health, we tend to use evidence-informed rather than evidence-based, as many other considerations are needed in addition to the evidence to include values, imperatives, etc.
I think that's a really good point. I did quite a lot of work with what became the UK Health Security Agency during COVID, and of course there's a lot of people, they brought a lot of people on, and the health way of using evidence is a really good one, and evidence-informed I think is a great term that captures that. If I may just jump in, sorry, if I may just jump in, it's a great comment here from Dan as well. Avoiding the siloed nature of work streams and departments is always a tricky issue. This is a point really close to my heart. You cannot avoid siloed work streams. It's just integral to human nature. trying to avoid it generally causes problems. Accepting that to some extent it's going to happen and building systems that allow for the fact and mitigate it is, I think, a really, really important way to go with this. Because if you try and avoid them, you often convince yourself that you've achieved something you haven't. Accepting that they're going to be there and coming up with the best mitigations for them, something very, very dear to my heart.
Brilliant. I
Sorry,
was
Kenda,
just
I
going
just
to,
wanted to
no,
speak on that particular point.
Thomas, don't worry. I was just going to say this. It's been a great webinar from everybody's engagement as well.
Really good
Just
questions. Thank you all.
I think there was one quote that was shared by one of our delegates. It says, thanks to you both. Ideally, there will be some hip hop quotes at the end. Maybe we'll save that for next time. But
Okay, good
everybody,
feedback.
thank
I
you
like
very
it.
much. We're just a minute over our normal time. Thank you for supporting
Awesome.
us as always. We will share, like I said, just look out for our side pack. No, it's just the recording, I should say, in the next 48 hours. If you can, just give us as much feedback as we can, and we'll come up with the next topic, which will be in touch with you within the next 28 days. Have a lovely afternoon and the rest of the week, everybody. Thank you.
Do it again.